Good evening, good night, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the second episode of Terra Incognita. Today brought to you by our Dutch team, our Dutch Arctos team, but in English because we are covering a topic that will be of interest to all Arctos viewers and listeners, Esoteric Hitlerism. I'm your guest, Alexander, your host, Alexander Wolfheze, and with me today is again my fellow Dutch writer for Arctos, actually from Frisja, of course, and a fellow traditionalist, Sietze Bosman. Welcome to the show, Sietze.
Thank you, Alexander, and it's a pleasure to be with you as always.
Well, as I said to the audience, we will be covering esoteric Hitlerism as our second topic. This topic needs a little bit of introduction, and for several reasons. The first is that there is a concern of censorship, of course, because the topic that we are talking about includes a name that is subject to censorship. That, of course, was the German chancellor from 1933 to 1945. And his name is synonymous with all that is bad in the West, and objective talking about him is probably not possible at this present time in Europe. That being said, our topic does not cover the historical phenomenon, but it rather covers phenomena that is taking place after his life, namely the reception of his legacy among people of a probably spiritual inclination, as well as a metapolitical field of studies, because that is also what it is, esoteric Hitlerism. It's a phenomenon that started quite shortly after the death of the subject in April 1945. And that is still developing today. So we are talking about a living phenomenon about which we cannot give yet an historical assessment. There is a second reason why we need to be cautious introducing this subject. That is the fact that, of course, the European peoples are subject to, I would call that psychological disturbances, traumas. We can call it a collective state of probably trauma that is occurring in Europe after 1945, as well as a kind of a Stockholm syndrome situation in which European peoples find themselves unable to live through their history, experience their history, and think it through to the end. That is simply not possible at this time. And that also brings us to the mythological aspect of our topic today. There, where history writing, history talking, and history teaching is not really possible, myth arises, mythologies arise. Of course, there are also people that are made that create the world around them in a way that is almost semi-mythological. So these two aspects, of course, go together in the topic today, esoteric Hitlerism. That all being said, as in preparation, let us go to the subject matter at hand. We will be each talking about the person that we chose within the movement of esoteric Hitlerism. And the person that you want to talk about today, Sietze, comes, of course, from South America. Please tell us a little bit about the person and a little bit about what you understand about his philosophy and where he's coming from.
Yes, well, Miguel Serrano was a diplomat from Chile, from South America. And after the Second World War, he was already into spiritual teachings and about yoga and into Hinduism, and he was quite a fanatical student of all kinds of spiritual teachings and religions in the world. But after the Second World War, he integrated the phenomenon of Hitler into a new way of thinking, into a new teaching, and that is what is called esoteric Hitlerism. So he integrated the person, or the physical phenomenon, the earthly phenomenon of Hitler was an expression of spiritual forces, of a galactic spiritual war between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and they found their expression in the person of Hitler. So he So around the phenomena of Hitler, he created this constellation of ideas that he borrowed from Gnosticism, from Hinduism, from Tantra, yoga, from alchemy and Kabbalistic ideas, and he created a very interesting, very broad, and very deep spiritual philosophy and teaching that basically revolves around the phenomena of Hitler.
Well, that ties us into the person that I want to talk about today. That is Savitri Devi, Savitri Devi Mukherjee, of course. That's her full Indian name. A Greek philosopher, somebody that dedicated the latter part of her life to esoteric Hitlerism, but somebody that came from a different background, so not a political, not a diplomatic background, but a intellectual, a philosophical background. She, of course, also uses the idea, similar to what Serrano did, of Hitler as an avatar, more precisely, precursor to the final faulty avatar that people that know that comes from the Vedic tradition. By the way, approximately equivalent the Xiao San to the Xiao San, that is a figure in the Zoroastrian tradition, and also not dissimilar to what we find in the Shia Islamic tradition in the form of the Mahdi, the final redeemer. A theme that she wrote about extensively, that she considered in a very subtle way. Her writing is not precisely spiritual, it is also philosophical and historical. She did a lot of scientific research in the topics that were dear to her. Although she was in her life the prototype of what we call a cat lady, and she was also vegetarian, she was somebody that looked at the matter at a very austere level, a very precise intellectual level. By the way, that is also visible in Serrano. Serrano did his best to, of course, describe what he wanted to say in quite precise ways, in comparing it to traditions, as you already mentioned, from all over the world. And here, of course, we come to the topic of archetype. So the archetype represented in esoteric Hitlerism. Can you say something more about that, Sietze?
Yes. From the works of Serrano, it is he lays out very nicely this idea that there is a collective unconscious that every people possess, basically. And the Germans, after the First World War, were humiliated before the world. They were, enormous tracts of lands were stolen from them. They had a massive reparation payments imposed on them. They were locked in poverty, hyperinflation, mass unemployment, starvation, mass suicide, because people were just so depressed because of the situation. And so this translates into this dark energy that pents up in this dark collective unconscious of a people. And he was friends with Carl Jung, of course, and Jung has this whole range of archetypes, and in this situation, it is the shadow archetype. So this dark, disturbed field, basically in the collective unconscious that was building up. But there are only a few ways in which you can handle such a shadow archetype. You can find constructive ways or peaceful ways in finding to resolve this trauma, or they will just like a volcano explode. And according to Miguel Serrano, this explosion came in the form of the persona of Hitler. He knew how to tap into this archetypical collective consciousness and find the energy that gave him the impetus to start the movement.
Yes, of course, you're talking about the aftermath of the First World War. Now we are talking about esoteric Hitlerism, which is, of course, post in the aftermath of the Second World War, which, if anything, is a bigger trauma for European people than even the First World War. And I think you quite rightly mentioned the suppressed energy, the pent up energy, the way people cannot express themselves, the way whole people can simultaneously go through a trauma, go through a period of muteness. And here I'd like to mention something that ties into this topic in an indirect way. I've mentioned it in my book, Rupes Nigra. There has been no objective talk about the Hitler phenomenon, the Third Reich, and history before 1945 for a very long time in Europe now. And esoteric Hitlerism fits into that situation in which there is no formal free discourse. There is a singer called Kate Bush. People that are older will remember her. In 1989, so exactly 100 years after the birth of Adolf Hitler, she wrote a song. And it's called Heads We Are Dancing. So if you read that song, the lyrics, she is a quite genius artist, somebody that has been rightly called a traditional British witch in many ways. But witches, of course, also express certain truths and certain realities in a different artistic way. So she said, a picture of you, it couldn't be true. The devil is a charming man. Picture of Hitler. Do you want to dance? So these are sentences from that song, which show that 100 years after the birth of that person who is long time dead and many years after the war that has been concluded, Europeans are still unable to talk freely and are forced to resort to all kinds of other ways to express themselves. Now, esoteric Hitlerism is one of these expressions. Of course, it's only given to a few people to fathom the depths of that. So people that are able to access quite difficult to find manuscripts, for example, and people who are able to think very freely outside of the box, and people who are able to access traditions, knowledge streams that are important for that. Now, one person that did that was Savitri Devi. She made a study, and I'd like to mention one of the ideas of her book. So she mentioned that, of course, archetypes get incarnated, as Sietze pointed out, and these archetypes then take different shape according to the time in which they live. So the traditionalist point of view on the world is that cosmological cycles degrade from the Golden Age to the Silver Age to the Bronze Age to the Heroic Age to the Iron Age. That we are living in the last age is something that is commonly acknowledged even in the Christian tradition. And it is very present in the Vedic tradition, of course. And Savitri Devi, she studied history through that lens. And she said, so in the Golden Age or a Silver Age, the principle, the avatar of the just king, the just ruler, the person that is responsible for law and order and for guiding people to higher goals, is still able to create a direct living link between the upper world and the lower world. So he calls that the man above time. So a king would literally incarnate a divine principle in the Golden and Silver Age. She mentioned Akhenaten, Egyptian pharaoh in this regard. And she says if you go to a later age, the Heroic Age or the Bronze Age, you get another more degraded link. That is the man in time, the man who functions in time, who incarnates time in his person. And she gives as an example Genghis Khan, who was able to build a world empire, restore to a certain extent law and justice, and she understands it, and the proper natural order of things, but who does so without creating a direct link with the upper world. And in the last age, she says, such a thing is not possible anymore. There is not a man over time. There is not a man in time. There is only a man against time. So she understood what she calls the Hitler avatar in this sense, that it is a man who necessarily, naturally stands against the worldly state of affairs, who must fight it, and, as she says, must die in it. That is how she said. That's quite tragic. If you compare that to Serrano's take, what is something that strikes you? What do you find striking in his teachings?
Well, I think that Savitri Devi and Serrano have quite a large overlap in this way of thinking, because Serrano exactly describes it as the same thing. For instance, he said that he, meaning Hitler, is the avatar who will renew the world, who will take us to the new golden age after the fall of the Kali Yuga. Hitler is the ultimate weapon in the battle against the forces of darkness. He is the god warrior who fights for the survival of light and spirit. So very clearly, he also believes that we are in this Kali Yuga, this Iron Age, and that must come to an end. And this is signified by somebody who will herald in the new golden age. And these are so he places, just like Devi does, the phenomenon of Hitler at the pivotal point between the golden age and the Iron Age. So that's a very striking similarity between the ideas between Devi and Serrano.
Yes, of course, they were in correspondence during their life, the two, Serrano and Savitri Devi. They had a lively correspondence. Their works were probably influenced by each other as well. And although they were separated by a quite formidable geographic distance, almost exactly at opposite poles of the world, there is an interesting thing about the location, by the way, of Serrano in this regard. He came from Chile, and his take on geopolitics and geography was quite special. It was formed, of course, by his Chilean homeland. He looked at the world from there, and he, of course, placed a special value on a place that was claimed partially by Chile, Antarctica, so the South Pole, the South Polar continent. Now, of course, we are reaching here into the heart of esoteric Hitlerism. Can you say something about the role of Antarctica and how you read that in Serrano?
Well, Serrano writes a lot about the Aryan people, and the Aryan people are supposedly, by Serrano, the descendants of the Hyperboreans. And the Hyperboreans are people who came from supposedly lands beyond freezing mountains. At least there's a Greek source who tells us about this. I forgot his name. So there is a direct link in many writings and spiritual teachings that the Hyperborean people, or the Hyperboreans, they came from these icy lands. Well, Antarctica, for instance, because now Antarctica is, of course, frozen over. But we know that in history, the Antarctic continent was free of ice for large periods of time, because from receding glaciers, we have found trees, under receding glaciers. So these places were inhabited. And I believe that Serrano places in the well, of course, Hyperborea, I believe, is above the boreal forests, meaning that would be the North Pole. But he also places them in the South Pole. I'm not exactly how he creates this link, but I think this harkens back to an even older idea about this Atlantean society, which was in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, or Atlantic Ocean, sorry. And because this continent sank, there were 60 million people allegedly on this continent, which most of them drowned, but a lot of them fled to all the directions in the world, and they took their Aryan Hyperborean lineage to many places, including South America. There are many indications that Aryan peoples have been to the South Americas long before Christopher Columbus or the Spanish ever did. You find, for instance, swastika symbolism all over ancient pyramids and temples in the Americas. So there's an ancient connection with South America and the Hyperboreans and the Atlanteans, and Serrano writes quite elaborately about these connections.
Well, of course, Antarctica is, properly speaking, the North Pole. That means, energetically speaking, I'm talking about the magnetic field around the Earth. So that's the plus, and Arctica is the minus. So in that sense, there is something to be said for Antarctica as the true North. It's also the true North in the sense that it is, of course, the equivalent of the Dvipa that Tilak talks about a lot. So the place that is now frozen over, an island, which of course Antarctica is. It is a continent, unlike the Arctic Ocean that is just dotted with a few islands. So this continent, of course, also features very lively and very greatly in esoteric Hitlerist literature and dramatic novelization, and even in movies. So it is, of course, rumored that the Germans in the Second World War created a base, U-boat base in Antarctica in a territory called Neuschwabenland. Our colleague in Arctos, Jason Giorgiani, he has written extensively about these things if people are interested in it. And it is in Serrano that we see this idea linked also to the mythological survival of Hitler. So that's another issue. Of course, South America has long been rumored to be a hideout of neo-Nazis, National Socialists who have escaped from the dying Reich. So that's something that is well known. And there is a mythological aspect to that returns in esoteric Hitlerism. So it's the survival of the leader, of the avatar, but going underground, going in occultation. So being occulted from human side, that is normal human side, and only initiates may access that person. So there are parallels for the same motive in European traditions. King Arthur falls in this category, but also more worldly, for example. German Emperor Barbarossa falls in this category. The king in the mountain, the king who has disappeared, and the king who bides his time to come back. So both Serrano and Savitri Devi, they refer to this occultation, although they look at it not exactly the same as far as I'm aware. And that is something that I wanted to also ask you about. So, Sietze, to what extent do you think that within esoteric Hitlerism, survival of the avatar is something that should be looked at materially, or it should be looked at spiritually, or both? How do you look at that?
Yeah, that's a nice question. In principle, I don't think his death or his survival really matters to the ideas that Serrano put forward, because Hitler was nothing more than an incarnation of cosmic forces, and if he died or if he lived, the battle was lost to a certain extent. At least the war was lost on the continent, and I don't think for the formation of his ideas about esoteric Hitlerism, his life or death wasn't particularly interesting or important. And I don't know how that would work for Savitri Devi, but I think Serrano would have formulated his ideas no matter if he was alive or dead.
Well, in that regard, again, I bring up Jason Giorgiani. So he proposes in some of his writings a scenario, a theoretical scenario in which there is a literal survival. Savitri Devi, of course, didn't do that. She literally walked into the sea at the moment she heard that Germany had lost the war. She wanted to drown herself. At that moment, she says, I got a vision, and she said to herself, I will not drown myself, but rather dedicate my life to fighting a lost cause, fighting a uphill battle, very literally in her life. She made her life living hell in many respects by persecution and by incarceration. But she dedicated it to the best of her understanding according to the ideals that she served. Of course, there is now another aspect to esoteric Hitlerism as time progresses, as we are moving into a time that there is no living memory of the 40s, the 1940s anymore. We are seeing a very interesting phenomenon exactly this last month, I think. It is perhaps a coincidence, but we wanted to do this podcast. And what do we see the last month is a lively online debate, mostly in the alternative medias, but with some overlaps into the regular media, on social media also, about the status, of course, of Hitler, directly and indirectly. It's a kind of a reassessment is taking place. It started with people like Stu Peters, of course, who took a very strong position, but there's also this Candace Owen, a black woman from America, publicist, who very strongly the standard narrative, the standard Western narrative about history, attacking very specifically Churchill, of course. And following on that, we are seeing in the social media sphere, in the alternative media sphere, a wholesale reassessment, let's say it, of European history, also under force of circumstances. I think the ruling elite has discredited itself so far, so much that it is almost inevitable. But again, we are seeing that very marginally there is now first very cautious talk about the reassessment also of these war leaders. Now, esoteric Hitlerism, of course, exists independently of that. Um, uh, it is rather incarnated in people as a belief system, I think. And we get a very strange balancing act now. On the one hand, we have this public sphere debate, which is shifting. And on the other hand, we have this continuation of esoteric Hitlerism among many people, at least in the private sphere. How do you think these things will meet each other? What is your assessment of that?
I think that with every spiritual teaching and with every ideology and belief system, there is an exoteric and an esoteric component. And I believe that what we see on the internet right now is, especially in America, which of course still enjoy the protection of the First Amendment, with the implementation of AI algorithms, they can now translate his speeches into English. And Americans, of course, are, as Putin so nicely said, are an uncultured people. They do not speak any foreign languages, and they have no understanding of cultures that are not American. So now, for the first time, the speeches of Hitler are available to them in a language that they themselves can understand. And now, all of a sudden, they hear this man speak about mobilizing his people, standing for the ideals of his people, for his fatherland, for the blood and the women and the children of his folk. And a completely different story is being told now by AI and people who translate his speeches. So there is an exoteric variant of Nazism is now spreading over Twitter. There is an enormous amount of interest in Hitler and what he stood for. And people are beginning to notice and see and understand that he was fighting a force that is still a force that is plaguing us today. As Serrano said, it is a cosmic war between the forces of light and darkness. And because the Germans lost, the forces of darkness basically eliminated the last big hurdle they had on the European continent. And Americans are seeing that their country is being destroyed by the exact same forces that laid waste to Europe before the Second World War. And because they are so historically ignorant, this never occurred to them before, and all they saw was this weird man with a mustache screaming on television in a language they couldn't understand. So they instinctively, and of course via programming, understood this to mean, well, kill all the Germans or kill all the Jews or whatever. And now they're hearing that's totally not the message that he spread. But as esoteric Hitlerism is concerned, I think that it will always remain the equivalent of an esoteric teaching. I mean, if you read Serrano, it goes from aliens and sort of alien human hybrids that were the precursors to the Hyperboreans and the Aryans, and it's all very deep and very out there. It's quite a complicated, large constellation of a unique blend of spiritual ideas, which will never be really palatable to the masses. But there is this sort of esoteric Hitlerism light that is spreading among a lot of people. And then you have to think in terms of, as I mentioned before the Second World War, there was this shadow archetype prevalent among the German people. But with the arrival of the phenomenon of Hitler, this was transmuted or transformed into the heroic archetype. The negative impulses or the hatreds and the anger that were there were transmuted into a positive energy, into people rallying behind one cause and one folk and one ideal and one flag and one nation. And that was an incredibly powerful phenomenon, accompanied by an incredibly effective aesthetic. Everything they did aesthetic wise helped to strengthen this idea of nationhood and of a common ancestry. And this version of Hitlerism, the sacrifice and the fighting for your fatherland, I think this resounds with a lot of people, and they are beginning to see that, as General Patton even said, we fought the wrong guys.
Well, of course, this ties into something that me and you as traditionalists recognize, and that is the role of eternal principles, eternal archetypes in collective psyche. So you and me, we are not national socialists. This is also the reason that we can speak, of course. But we are people that understand these things also in a quite subtle way as, let's say, latter-day phenomenon connected to very ancient archetypes. So latter-day phenomenon interpreted as maybe degraded or not perfect, very late versions of an original form, an original expression. You're talking about avatars and AI. So that is very interesting because both Savitri Devi and Serrano talked about the avatar role in esoteric Hitlerism. And the avatar is exactly something that we see back in AI. So in AI, AI itself is an avatar, right? And we see that people that are using social media pseudonymously, anonymously, also use avatars. And we see the creation of avatar forces literally through AI as well. So this is a very interesting juxtaposition that technology and mythology in a certain sense are meeting each other. So I do believe there is some kind of a shift happening that allows for this combination at this moment. So that is certainly a very interesting and worthwhile point of view. Now, I'd also like to remind the audience that the symbolism attached to esoteric Hitlerism is not entirely the same as what was attached to that of the Third Reich.
Of course, that was a complete taboo to all of a sudden wear the symbols that were honored in your own culture. All of a sudden, they were outlawed. The denazification of Germany and the vilification of its symbolism and its aesthetic was something that impacted much more of Europe than just the Germans. I think that even in Russia, the swastika was a part of the cultural heritage, as it was even for certain groups of Native Americans in the North American continent, for instance. So we find the swastika everywhere, and it was outlawed after the Second World War. But I think there is, and again in the Baltic states, for instance, there people are actively reclaiming the use of their own cultural traditional symbols, in which the swastika is an integral part. It has always been, and they are reclaiming it because I think that the forces that want to outlaw these symbols have overplayed their hand, and their extortion scheme, their emotional blackmail scheme, is wearing thin, and people are shaking off the effects of this brainwashing, and especially young people. They are floating in this ocean of nihilism, of rootlessness, of a lack of culture, lack of meaning, lack of roots, and they are reclaiming things like traditional clothing and traditional artwork and their symbols. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And for instance, of course, the National Socialists used runic symbols. And this has been going on for a bit longer because there are a lot of music groups from the heavy metal scene have been using runic symbolism for quite a long time. Not because they wanted to come across as National Socialists, but purely because many of these heavy metal bands come from Scandinavia, and Viking culture is all about runic symbols, of course. So I think that the heavy suppression of these symbols is weakening. It is falling apart because people all over Europe and perhaps all over the world want to regain their own history and their own culture, and symbolism is a very strong part of that. And if you read Serrano, who speaks extensively about this collective unconscious, these symbols are, of course, because they have been used for millennia, an integral part of these collective unconsciousness, and they will find their way out. And I think symbols are still very powerful means of people to connect to their collective unconsciousness. So these symbols are not just scribblings on paper. They represent real forces, real archetypical forces, and real spiritual entities that they can embrace to reconnect with their past. And I think that this movement is basically unstoppable.
Well, you're talking about, of course, the egregore. So let's say a comprehensive expression in a human form or in a political force field of an archetype, something that has been seen in other cultures as well. And in this regard, we can say, like Mao Zedong was an integral part of Chinese history and Stalin of Russian history. So, of course, the figure of Adolf Hitler was the same in European history. It's not something that can be eradicated. It is something that must be integrated. It cannot be forcefully expelled because then it will boomerang back with even greater force. And I think we are starting to see effects of that boomerang effect. So very absurd continuation of the post-war psychology that was imposed on Europe, the forcefully imposed narrative, is starting to reach, let's say, epidemic portion. So these days, all enemies of, let's say, the hostile regime governing Europe are Hitler. So anybody that stands up against their rule, the hostile elite's rule, is now equivalent to the same person. So they made their own kind of esoteric Hitlerism, kind of an inverse version of it. And that is, of course, coming back to haunt them, because if you cry wolf too often, the warning loses its force and people start to doubt you. They start to doubt your narrative. That's something that certainly we are seeing currently. I'd like to conclude with a short anecdote. In the year 2018 in Holland, in Rotterdam station, I was standing there under a large screen in the main station hall. Many international visitors will know that hall. It is the place where many people from Britain and France and Italy arrive for the first time when they go on a train trip to the north and they arrive in Holland. They visit Rotterdam and there they are greeted with this modern station hall. There is a large screen there, and on this screen, of course, are all kinds of advertisements placed. But on that occasion, when I was standing there, on the screen was an advertisement for a bookshop, a station bookshop, the ACO bookshop. People that are in Holland know what that is, where they sell, let's say, light travel literature. And there they had a book of 10 passing the screen. Book number 10, book number 9, book number 8, and so forth to book number 1. And nobody saw it, but I was looking up at the screen and I saw number 1, Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. With that, I thank the audience for their attention. And so, Sietze, thank you very much for being present.
Yes, of course, it was an honor.
Thank you and goodbye.